Picture this. A woman sits on a throne that was never meant for her. Around her, the most powerful men in the empire bow low, their faces pressed to marble floors. But in the shadows behind gilded pillars, hands are already moving. Letters are being written. Poison is being prepared. Blades are being sharpened. Because here's what they don't tell you about history's most powerful female rulers. The real danger didn't come from foreign armies or peasant revolts. It came from the men who smiled at them during the day and plotted their destruction by night. Some of these women survived 20 assassination attempts. Others didn't survive the first. But every single one of them was feared so deeply that entire courts mobilized to erase them from existence. And here's the twist. Many of them succeeded in that erasure. The women I'm about to show you, you've probably never heard their names. That was intentional. So let me introduce you to the female rulers who terrified empires so much that those empires chose to forget them entirely.
Now, before we dive into these stories, you need to understand something fundamental about how imperial courts actually worked. And I'm not talking about the sanitized version you learned in school. Imperial courts weren't just centers of governance. They were ecosystems of power where every title, every position, every grain of influence was carefully distributed among noble families, military commanders, and religious authorities. And here's the critical part. This entire system was built on one unshakable assumption. Men rule, women influence from the margins. When a woman stepped directly into sovereign power, she didn't just break a rule, she shattered the entire operating system. Because suddenly, all those carefully negotiated power arrangements, worthless. That general who spent 20 years building favor with the emperor's uncle, he now answers to someone who owes him nothing. Those noble families who married their daughters into the royal line, expecting to control the throne through their grandsons, a female ruler could produce her own heirs or choose her own successors, cutting them out entirely. But here's what made female rulers uniquely terrifying to these courts. They were unpredictable variables in a system designed for predictability. A king had to maintain relationships with the military elite, the landed aristocracy, the merchant classes. He was bound by centuries of tradition about who gets what. But a woman who fought her way to power? She owed nothing to anyone except those who helped her get there. She could elevate commoners, dismantle ancient privileges, redistribute wealth to entirely new factions. And that's exactly what they did. Over the next 40 minutes, I'm taking you through the lives of 6 female rulers who made imperial courts so nervous that those courts devoted enormous resources to one singular goal: making these women disappear. We're talking about empires spanning from medieval Europe to imperial Persia, from East Africa to the heart of India. Different centuries, different cultures, but the same pattern repeating over and over again. Fear, conspiracy, elimination. Let's meet the women who were too powerful to be allowed to exist. Our first ruler started her life as absolutely nobody, and I need you to understand how impossible that makes her story. Irene was an orphan from Athens, not Constantinople, the glittering capital of the Byzantine Empire. Athens, a backwater city living off memories of ancient glory. She had no family connections, no wealth, no political leverage. In 768, she was selected to marry the Byzantine heir Leo for one reason only. She was beautiful and unthreatening. The imperial court wanted a decorative empress who would produce heirs and stay silent. They catastrophically misjudged her. Within 10 years of arriving at court, Irene had done something extraordinary. She'd built her own faction, not through her husband, who largely ignored her, not through seduction or manipulation, through something the court never saw coming. She became a religious icon. The Byzantine Empire was tearing itself apart over iconoclasm, the debate over whether religious images were holy or heretical. Irene positioned herself as the defender of icon veneration, which meant she had the support of monks, common people, and half the military. When her husband died in 780, leaving their 10-year-old son Constantine VI as emperor, Irene became regent. And here's where she made her first bold move. Every previous regent in Byzantine history had understood their role. Keep the throne warm until the boy comes of age, then step aside gracefully. Irene kept the throne warm. She just never stepped aside. For 17 years, she ruled as regent while her son grew into adulthood. She crushed a military rebellion led by generals who thought a woman couldn't command armies. She did it by personally negotiating with the rebel troops, promising them better pay and land grants, something those generals never thought to offer. The rebellion collapsed in 3 days. Then, in 787, she did something that would echo through history. She called the Second Council of Nicaea, overturning decades of iconoclasm and restoring religious image veneration. Understand what this meant. A woman, acting as regent, had convened an ecumenical council that reshaped Christian doctrine. She didn't ask permission from the Pope, she didn't consult with male religious authorities first, she simply declared it would happen. And it happened. The court was beginning to realize they had a problem, but they still thought they had an exit strategy. Constantine VI would turn 18, assume full power, and his mother would fade into a comfortable retirement. Irene had other plans. When Constantine tried to assert his authority in 790, she refused to yield. The military forced her into brief exile, but within 2 years she'd orchestrated her return by exploiting her son's political mistakes. And then, in 797, she did the unthinkable. She had her own son blinded and imprisoned. Now, I know how that sounds, but here's the context the histories often skip. Constantine VI had just divorced his wife to marry his mistress, enraging the church. He'd lost multiple military campaigns. His authority was crumbling. Irene didn't act out of maternal cruelty. She acted because she'd spent 27 years building power, and she wasn't going to let an incompetent heir destroy everything. And then she took the final step. She declared herself emperor. Not empress, emperor. She used the masculine title because there was no precedent for a woman ruling in her own right. She signed documents as basileos, the masculine form. For 5 years, Irene ruled the Byzantine Empire as its sole monarch. She negotiated with Charlemagne as an equal. She reformed tax codes. She appointed her own generals. And every single day, the male aristocracy seethed. Because here's what they understood. If Irene could do this, any woman could. The entire system of male succession was revealed as nothing more than tradition, not divine law, not natural order, just tradition. And traditions can be broken. Now let's jump continents and forward 4 centuries to medieval India, where another woman decided that being told no just meant she hadn't asked loudly enough. Razia Sultan was born into the royal family of the Delhi Sultanate, but she had 3 older brothers. In the mathematics of medieval succession, that meant she was irrelevant, except her father, Sultan Iltutmish, noticed something his sons lacked: competence. While her brothers were busy drinking and hunting and playing politics, Razia was sitting in on administrative meetings, learning military strategy, studying Persian and Arabic so she could read legal and religious texts herself. When Iltutmish needed someone to govern Delhi while he was on campaign, he didn't choose one of his sons. He chose Razia. She was 16 years old. For months, she ran the capital of one of the most powerful empires in Asia. She heard legal cases, she managed the treasury, she coordinated with military commanders, and she did it so effectively that when her father returned, he announced a decision that stunned the entire court. He announced that Razia would succeed him as sultan. Not his sons, his daughter. The nobility laughed. They literally laughed, because this was medieval India, where women of noble families lived in purdah, behind screens and veils, never seeing unrelated men. The idea of a woman sitting on the throne, commanding armies, holding public court, it was absurd. Iltutmish died in 736. The nobility immediately installed his brother Rukunuddin as sultan. Rukunuddin lasted 6 months before his incompetence became unbearable. He spent his days drinking. His mother, the Dowager Queen, was actually running the government, and she was executing nobles and confiscating property to fund her lavish lifestyle. The nobility came to Razia and begged her to take the throne. And here's what she did that changed everything. She walked out of the palace and into the streets of Delhi wearing full masculine royal regalia, no veil, no purdah. She appeared before the common people and said simply, "Your rightful sultan is here." The city erupted in her support. Within days, Rukn ad-Din was deposed and imprisoned. Razia became sultan, and she made it clear immediately that she was not going to be a figurehead. First bold move, she stopped wearing women's clothing entirely. She appeared in court dressed as a male sultan, with a turban and coat. She rode horses through the streets. She sat in public durbar where any subject could approach her with grievances. Everything about her presentation said, "I am not a woman playing at power. I am the sultan." Second bold move, she promoted based on merit, not lineage. She elevated Jamal-ud-Din Yaqut, an Abyssinian slave, to the position of master of the stables, one of the highest court positions. The nobility was apoplectic. Not only was she promoting a foreigner and a former slave, but rumors spread that they were romantically involved. Whether true or not, what mattered was this: Razia was demonstrating that the old rules of aristocratic privilege meant nothing to her. For 3.5 years, she ruled effectively. She led military campaigns personally, riding at the head of her armies. She expanded the empire's territory. She commissioned roads and wells. She established schools and libraries. Contemporary accounts from both Muslim and Hindu sources describe her as just, capable, and remarkably intelligent. But every single day, the nobility was plotting, because Razia represented an existential threat to their power structure. If a woman could rule this successfully, what did that say about all their claims of masculine superiority? What did it say about the system of noble privilege they'd built their entire identities around? The answer was simple. Razia had to go. And we'll get to how they accomplished that, but first let me show you one more woman who made similar enemies. Ruler C, Olga of Kiev. Kievan Rus, 890 to 969 CE. Quick profile here because Olga's story is less about administrative brilliance and more about sheer terrifying competence. When Olga's husband, Prince Igor of Kiev, was murdered by a neighboring tribe called the Drevlins in 945, the Drevlins assumed the obvious next step. They'd marry Olga off to their prince, absorb Kiev into their territory, and that would be that. Olga was just a widow with a young son. What could she do? What she did was orchestrate one of the most brutal revenge campaigns in medieval history. When Drevlin ambassadors arrived to propose the marriage, she had them buried alive. When they sent more ambassadors, she burned them alive in a bathhouse. Then she invited Drevlin nobles to a funeral feast for her husband, got them drunk, and had her soldiers massacre 5,000 of them. Then she besieged their capital city. When it wouldn't surrender, she demanded a tribute of 3 pigeons and 3 sparrows from each household. Seems odd, right? She tied burning sulfur to the birds, released them, and they flew back to their nests in the city. The entire capital burned to the ground in hours. Olga ruled as regent for her son Sviatoslav for 18 years. During that time, she restructured the entire tax system of Kievan Rus, established trading posts, converted to Christianity decades before it became the state religion, and built diplomatic relations across Europe. Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII himself described Olga as a woman of exceptional intelligence. But here's what matters for our story. Olga demonstrated that a woman could be absolutely ruthless in the pursuit and maintenance of power. The nobility of Kiev feared her not because she was breaking gender norms, but because she was better at violence and strategy than any of them. 3 women, 3 empires, 3 paths to power, but all 3 faced the same problem: courts that couldn't tolerate their existence. And as you're about to see, those courts were just getting started.
Now we're going back in time to meet a woman whose origin story sounds like fiction. But I need you to pay attention to what happens when someone who has seen the absolute bottom of society suddenly finds themselves at the absolute top. Theodora was a circus performer. Specifically, she was an actress and dancer in the Constantinople Hippodrome, which in the 6th century was code for something much darker. Theater performers were considered barely above prostitutes. Theodora's father was a bear keeper. Her mother was an actress. When her father died, her mother put Theodora and her sisters on stage as children to earn money. We have contemporary accounts describing the performances, and they were explicitly sexual.
By her early 20s, Theodora was the mistress of a Syrian official. When he abandoned her, she found herself destitute in Alexandria, eventually making her way back to Constantinople working as a wool spinner. This wasn't a woman born into privilege who fell from grace. This was someone who intimately understood what it meant to be powerless in an empire that ground powerless people into dust. And then she met Justinian, heir to the Byzantine throne. Here's where the story gets interesting. Justinian was obsessed with her, not just attracted, obsessed. He wanted to marry her, but there was a law on the books that specifically forbade senators from marrying actresses. Justinian had his uncle, the Emperor Justin I, change the law, not quietly, publicly. He essentially told the entire Byzantine aristocracy that he was going to marry a former circus performer and they could either accept it or challenge him directly. They accepted it, but they never forgot it. When Justinian became emperor in 527, Theodora became empress, and she immediately made it clear she wasn't going to be a silent consort. In every official portrait, every coin, every document, she appeared alongside Justinian as co-ruler. She had her own court, her own income, her own staff. She held audiences separately from the emperor, and her decisions carried imperial weight. But here's what terrified the aristocracy. Theodora remembered where she came from, and she used her power to systematically dismantle the systems that had trapped her. She created the first known women's shelter in recorded history. She bought buildings in Constantinople and converted them into refuges where women fleeing prostitution could live, learn trades, and build new lives. She passed laws that prohibited forcing women into sex work. She made it illegal for a pimp to claim ownership of a woman's earnings. She established legal protections for actresses and performers. The male aristocracy was horrified, not because they cared about prostitution, but because Theodora was using imperial power to elevate the lowest classes of women. Women these nobles considered disposable were suddenly under imperial protection. The entire social hierarchy was being challenged. And then came the Nika riots in 532, and this is where you see exactly why the court feared her. The riots started as chariot racing dispute and exploded into a full rebellion. Two rival political factions united against Justinian, burned half of Constantinople, and proclaimed a new emperor. The imperial palace was surrounded. Justinian's advisors, all of them men, all of them nobles, told him to flee. They had ships ready. The recommendation was unanimous: run, save your life, rebuild later. Theodora stood up in that council meeting and gave a speech that was recorded by the court historian Procopius. She said, and I'm paraphrasing here, "Royalty is a fine burial shroud. If you want to flee, Emperor, the ships are ready, but I will not run. If I die as an empress." Justinian stayed. Theodora personally coordinated with General Belisarius to crush the rebellion. Within days, 30,000 rioters were dead and the revolt was over. But here's what that moment revealed. When the crisis came, the male advisors folded. The former circus performer held firm. From that point forward, the court understood something chilling. Theodora wasn't just an unusual empress. She was the stronger half of the imperial partnership. She had strategic vision, she had ruthlessness, and she had zero tolerance for aristocratic privilege. She began involving herself in theological disputes, backing the Monophysite Christians against the Chalcedonian Orthodox position that Justinian officially supported. This meant husband and wife were publicly on opposite sides of the era's biggest religious controversy. But Theodora didn't back down. She harbored Monophysite monks in the palace. She appointed Monophysite bishops. She effectively ran a parallel religious policy. The court was in a constant state of fear because they never knew which side of the imperial couple would prevail on any given issue, and increasingly it was Theodora who prevailed. She controlled intelligence networks. She had spies throughout the aristocracy. There are multiple documented cases of nobles being arrested, imprisoned, or having their property confiscated based on evidence that came from Theodora's personal intelligence service. The court understood that anything they said, even in private, might reach the empress. When Theodora died in 548, probably from cancer, Justinian was emotionally destroyed, but the aristocracy, they were relieved. For 17 years, they'd lived under a ruler who knew exactly how brutal the empire could be to the powerless and had decided to use imperial authority to change that. A woman who'd seen the worst of their world and come back to dismantle it, piece by piece. That kind of ruler doesn't just threaten individual nobles, she threatens the entire system.
Now here's what the historical records often sanitize: the sheer creativity of how imperial courts tried to destroy female rulers. We're not just talking about straightforward assassination attempts. We're talking about systematic campaigns designed to make these women's positions untenable, to delegitimize their authority so thoroughly that their removal would seem like a natural correction rather than a coup. Let's start with the most insidious weapon: reputation destruction. When Empress Irene was consolidating power in Byzantium, the male aristocracy couldn't attack her policies directly because, frankly, most of them were working. The empire was stable, the economy was functioning, the military was loyal. So they attacked something else: her femininity itself. Court officials began circulating rumors that Irene was involved in an incestuous relationship with her chief advisor, a eunuch named Stauracius. Think about the calculation here. They couldn't claim she was sleeping with him in the conventional sense because he was physically incapable, but they could create whispers of an unnatural relationship, something perverse. The goal wasn't to make people believe it literally. The goal was to make people feel viscerally uncomfortable with a woman wielding power. Other rumors suggested she was dabbling in witchcraft, that she consulted astrologers before making military decisions, that she was mentally unstable. None of this had to be proven, it just had to circulate. Death by 1,000 whispers. But Irene had a counter-strategy that was brilliant in its simplicity. She leaned into religious authority. Every major decision she made, she framed in theological terms. When she restored icon veneration, she didn't present it as her personal preference, she presented it as divine will revealed through church councils. This made attacking her policy equivalent to attacking church doctrine. The rumors continued, but they couldn't gain enough traction to undermine her actual power base. Razia Sultan faced a different kind of attack: manufactured scandal. Remember Jamaluddin Yakut, the Abyssinian slave she promoted to master of stables? The Delhi nobility weaponized that relationship. They spread stories that Razia and Yakut were lovers, that she was making policy decisions based on sexual infatuation rather than political judgment, that she rode through the streets unveiled specifically to meet him in secret. Here's the vicious part. It didn't matter if the rumors were true. What mattered was that they made Razia's competence invisible. Suddenly, every smart decision she made was reframed as Yakut's idea. Every military victory was attributed to her male commanders. Every administrative reform was dismissed as the work of her advisors. The rumors didn't have to destroy her directly, they just had to erase her agency. And Razia knew exactly what was happening. She addressed it head-on in a public durbar. Historical accounts record her saying something to this effect: "You complain that I favor Yakut because he is a foreigner and a former slave. But when I favor men of noble birth, you complain that I'm showing nepotism to aristocratic families. The truth is that you cannot accept that I make decisions based on merit, because accepting that would mean accepting my authority." Brilliant, but also dangerous, because she just openly acknowledged that the nobility was conspiring against her. That acknowledgement made the conflict explicit. The conspiracies escalated. Theodora faced multiple assassination attempts during her reign. The historical record documents at least 3 serious plots. One involved a group of senators planning to poison her during a state banquet. Theodora's spy network uncovered it. The conspirators were arrested, interrogated, and some were executed. But here's what the court records reveal. Theodora didn't announce the plot publicly. She handled it quietly, then continued appearing at state functions as if nothing had happened. This was psychological warfare. The nobles knew she knew, but by not making it public, she denied them martyrdom. They couldn't claim persecution, they couldn't rally public sympathy, they just disappeared. And everyone else understood the message.
I see everything, and I'm giving you one chance. Another plot against Theodora was more sophisticated. A faction of nobles tried to exploit religious tensions by claiming Theodora's support for monophysite Christianity was heretical and grounds for removal. They approached Pope Vigilius, trying to get papal condemnation of her theological positions. If they could get the church to officially declare Theodora a heretic, they could frame her deposition as religious duty rather than political rebellion. Theodora countered by essentially kidnapping the pope. When Vigilius arrived in Constantinople, she placed him under protective custody in the imperial palace. He stayed there for years, under constant pressure to support her theological position. The conspiracy collapsed because without papal backing, it was just regional nobles complaining about doctrine. The audacity of that move, holding the pope hostage to neutralize a political conspiracy. That's the kind of ruthlessness that made the court fear her. Tamar faced a different kind of threat, military betrayal. Several of her military commanders were nobles who resented taking orders from a woman. They couldn't rebel openly because her campaigns were too successful. Soldiers were getting rich from plunder, territory was expanding, the troops loved her. But the commanders plotted to engineer a military defeat so catastrophic that Tamar would be forced to abdicate in disgrace. In 1195, during a campaign against the Seljuks, two of her commanders deliberately withheld their forces from a crucial battle. The plan was simple: let the main army be overwhelmed, then arrive too late to help, blame the defeat on Tamar's strategic incompetence, present themselves as the competent alternatives. What they didn't account for was David Soslan, Tamar's husband. He was actually commanding the battle, and when he realized what was happening, he adapted on the battlefield. He repositioned the troops, changed tactics, and won despite being undermanned. Then he reported the commander's betrayal directly to Tamar. Her response was calculated. She didn't execute them, she reassigned them to administrative positions far from the capital. No dramatic punishment, no public trial, just a quiet removal of power that made it clear she knew exactly what they'd done. The other nobles got the message. I'm watching, and betrayal doesn't lead to martyrdom, it leads to irrelevance. But perhaps the most disturbing conspiracies were the ones that targeted not the rulers themselves, but their children. When Irene's son, Constantine VI, tried to assert his independence, the court encouraged it. They whispered to him that Irene was humiliating him but refusing to share power. They fed his resentment. They promised military support if he moved against Irene. This wasn't about helping Constantine. This was about creating a male alternative to Irene's rule. Constantine did eventually try to sideline his mother in 790. He had her confined to her palace. For a few years, he ruled alone. And he was terrible at it. He lost military campaigns, he alienated the church with his divorce and remarriage, he made enemies of powerful factions. The same nobles who'd encouraged his rebellion began undermining him too, because what they wanted wasn't Constantine specifically, they wanted anyone but Irene. By 797, Constantine was so unpopular that when Irene moved against him, she had broad support. But the blinding and imprisonment of her own son wasn't cruelty. It was the endpoint of a conspiracy that had used her child as a weapon against her. The court had forced her into a position where she had to choose, her son or her authority. They'd engineered that choice deliberately. Think about the psychological torture of that. Knowing that the nobles around you are actively trying to turn your child against you, not because they care about your child, but because they want to use him to destroy you. Razia faced threats against her supporters rather than herself. Nobles who backed her policies found themselves facing trumped-up charges. Their estates were raided by bandits who were clearly organized by rival nobles. Their sons were mysteriously excluded from military promotions. The message was clear: abandon Razia or watch your family's fortunes collapse. Some nobles broke under that pressure. They withdrew their support, claiming illness or age or personal matters. Razia's power base slowly eroded not through direct attacks on her, but through a campaign of targeted harassment against anyone who helped her. And here's the cruel genius of these strategies.
they were all technically legal. No one was openly rebelling, no one was committing treason. They were just exercising their rights as nobles to manage their estates, promote their allies, and express their religious opinions. The conspiracy hid behind the normal functioning of court politics. Meanwhile, these rulers had to maintain the appearance of absolute authority. They couldn't show fear. They couldn't show doubt. Every public appearance had to radiate confidence and control, because the moment they showed weakness, the conspiracies would accelerate into open rebellion. Imagine living like that, knowing that half the people bowing to you in court are actively plotting your downfall. Knowing that every meal might be poisoned, every military campaign might include a commander hoping you'll die in battle, every religious ceremony might be an opportunity for a fanatic to strike. Theodora dealt with it by building that intelligence network. She had informants everywhere, servants who reported conversations, monks who passed along confessions, merchants who noted which nobles were meeting in private. She turned the court's own structure against itself. Tamar dealt with it through strategic marriages and alliances. She married into the Ossetian royal family, giving her access to their military forces independent of Georgian nobles. She arranged marriages between her supporters and powerful families, creating a web of relationships that made conspiracy.
Let me show you how empires erase women who become too powerful to tolerate. Empress Irene's fall. Irene ruled as sole emperor of Byzantium for 5 years. 5 years of the most powerful empire in the Christian world being governed by a woman using a masculine title. And then, in 802, on October 31st, everything collapsed in a single night. Here's what you need to understand. Irene didn't fall because she made a catastrophic mistake. She fell because the court found the one thing she couldn't control: exhaustion. She was 50 years old. She'd been fighting for power for 34 years. Her health was declining, and critically, she'd begun relying more heavily on a eunuch advisor named Adios, giving him enormous influence over policy decisions. The court saw the opening. A group of officials led by the finance minister Nikephoros organized a coup. But here's the calculated brilliance of it. They didn't kill her. They didn't even arrest her during the day when she'd have loyal guards around her. They waited until late at night, entered the palace quietly, went to her private chambers, and simply informed her that she was no longer emperor. Irene was tired. That's what the historical accounts suggest. Not defeated in battle, not outmaneuvered politically, just tired. She'd spent decades fighting, and when armed men appeared in her bedroom telling her it was over, she didn't call for guards. She didn't threaten them. She asked what they intended to do with her. They exiled her to the island of Lesbos. Nikephoros took the throne. And here's the part that gets me. Irene died less than a year later. The official cause was natural illness, but she'd been healthy enough to rule just months before. I think she died because she stopped fighting. The thing that had kept her alive for 3 decades was the battle for power, and once that was taken from her, there was nothing left. The Byzantine court moved immediately to erase her legacy. They stopped using her theological reforms as precedent. They emphasized her blinding of Constantine VI in historical accounts, framing her entire reign as unnatural maternal cruelty rather than political necessity. Within 2 generations, she was remembered primarily as the woman who mutilated her son, not as the emperor who ruled an empire. That's how elimination works when you can't afford to make a martyr. You let her fade into irrelevance, then you rewrite the story. Razia Sultan's downfall was more violent and infinitely more tragic. In 1240, she was leading a military campaign to suppress a rebellion by one of her governors, Altunia, who controlled the region of Bathinda. But here's where the conspiracy that had been building for years finally activated. Her own army turned on her. The Turkish nobles who commanded her troops had been waiting for this moment. They were far from Delhi. Communication was slow. If something happened to Razia in the field, it would take weeks for news to reach the capital. They had plausible deniability. During the campaign, they arrested both Razia and Jamal-ud-Din Yakut. The accounts vary on exactly what happened next, but the most reliable sources suggest Yakut was killed almost immediately. Some say he was murdered by the soldiers. Others say he died fighting to protect Razia. And then something unexpected happened. Altunia, the rebel governor, fell in love with Razia. I know how that sounds, but the historical sources are consistent on this. Altunia had rebelled against her authority as sultan, but when he actually met her as a prisoner, something shifted. He proposed marriage, and Razia, calculating her options, accepted. Think about the psychology of that decision. She was a prisoner, her closest advisor and possible lover was dead, her army had betrayed her, but she didn't break. She saw an opportunity to regain power through this regional governor, and she took it. They married. Altunia and Razia then marched together toward Delhi to reclaim her throne. For a brief moment, it seemed possible. A deposed sultan and a rebel governor allied through marriage, leading an army to restore her rule. They never made it to Delhi. On the road, they were attacked by bandits, common thieves, the historical accounts claim. But here's what strains credibility. Common bandits somehow identified and killed both a sultan and a powerful regional governor, leaving everyone else in the traveling party alive? The timing was too convenient, the precision too exact. I think the court arranged it. They couldn't have Razia reaching Delhi. They couldn't risk her rallying support or creating a civil war, so they hired killers and disguised it as banditry. Razia Sultan died on October 13, 1240, somewhere on a dusty road between Bathinda and Delhi. She was approximately 35 years old. Her body was left where it fell. No royal burial, no memorial. For centuries, no one even knew exactly where she died. The Byzantine court moved instantly to legitimize her removal. They installed her brother Bahram as sultan and declared that order had been restored. Within months, chroniclers were writing accounts that emphasized Razia's violations of Purdah, her inappropriate relationship with Yakut, her unwomanly behavior. They framed her death not as assassination, but the inevitable consequence of a woman trying to hold power she was never meant to possess. Olga's elimination was more subtle because she'd positioned herself as regent, not sole ruler, but the pattern was the same. Once she became inconvenient, she was removed. She ruled as regent for 18 years while her son Sviatoslav was young, but when Sviatoslav came of age and began leading military campaigns, the nobility saw their opportunity. They didn't need to depose Olga, they just needed to make Sviatoslav ignore her. They encouraged his military ambitions, they praised his conquests, they fed his ego by constantly comparing him favorably to his father, the prince Olga had avenged, and they subtly, constantly suggested that taking advice from his mother made him look weak. Sviatoslav began excluding Olga from military decisions, then from diplomatic decisions, then from administrative decisions. By the 960s, Olga was still technically in the palace, but she had no real authority. Here's the cruel part. Olga had converted to Christianity decades earlier, hoping to bring Kiev into the Christian world. Sviatoslav remained pagan, partly because the nobility was pagan and he needed their support. So Olga's final years were spent watching her son undo her religious work, demolish her alliances, and ignore her counsel. She died in 969, still in the palace but powerless. The nobility had achieved what they wanted, her removal without martyrdom. She simply faded into irrelevance. After her death, Sviatoslav's rule became chaotic and violent. He died in battle just 3 years later. The Kievan Rus descended into civil war between his sons. Many historians believe that Sviatoslav had listened to Olga's advice, particularly her warnings about overextension and the importance of stable governance. He might have survived. But the court convinced him that a warrior king didn't need a mother's wisdom, and by the time he realized they were wrong, it was too late. The thing that's fascinating about Theodora is she's the only ruler on this list who died of natural causes while still in power. Cancer, most likely, in 548, at approximately 48 years old. But watch what happened immediately after her death, because this shows you just how much the court had been waiting for that moment. Within weeks, Justinian's policies shifted. The women's shelters Theodora had established, their funding was quietly redirected. The legal protections for actresses and sex workers, not repealed openly, but enforcement stopped. The Monophysite Christians she'd protected, suddenly facing persecution again. Justinian lived for another 17 years after Theodora's death, but he never remarried. He never found another partner with her political acumen. and historians note that the second half of his reign was markedly less successful than the first. The great reconquest of the Western Roman Empire stalled. Administrative reforms faltered. It's as if losing Theodora removed the strategic intelligence behind the throne. But here's how the court eliminated her legacy. They let Procopius publish his secret history. Procopius was the official court historian who wrote glowing public accounts of Justinian and Theodora's reign, but he also wrote a secret manuscript published after Theodora's death that portrayed her as a demonic nymphomaniac who'd slept her way to power and ruled through sexual manipulation and witchcraft. The accounts are so lurid they're almost certainly exaggerated or fabricated, but that didn't matter. The secret history became the version of Theodora that circulated for centuries. The shelters she built were forgotten. The legal reforms were attributed to Justinian alone. Theodora became a cautionary tale about what happens when you let an improper woman near power. Tamar was unique because she successfully managed her succession and died of natural causes, but even she couldn't fully escape the pattern. She died in 1213 after nearly 30 years of rule. She'd carefully positioned her son, Georgi IV, to inherit, and the succession was peaceful. Georgia remained powerful for decades after her death. In many ways, she won. But here's what happened to her historical reputation. The Georgian church canonized her as a saint, which sounds like an honor until you look at how sainthood functioned to contain her memory. As a saint, Tamar became primarily a religious figure. The military campaigns, the political cunning, the ruthless consolidation of power, those elements got softened in the hagiographies. She became Saint Tamar the Builder, known for commissioning churches, not for defeating the Seljuk Turks in battle. She became a pious Christian queen who happened to expand the kingdom, rather than a calculating political operator who used religion as a tool of state control. The Georgian chroniclers written after her death emphasized her beauty, her piety, her mercy. The harsh political realities of her reign got smoothed into a narrative more palatable to the male clergy writing the histories. This is subtle elimination. You acknowledge the ruler existed, you even celebrate her, but you reshape the story until the threatening parts disappear.
So here's the question that haunts me. Why did it take so much effort to erase these women? If female rulers were truly incompetent, their reigns would have collapsed on their own. There'd be no need for conspiracies, assassinations, or decades of historical revision. Incompetence eliminates itself. But that's not what happened. Empires had to actively, exhaustively work to remove these women and then erase the evidence of their success. That effort itself is the proof. These women weren't failures. They were threats to a system that couldn't tolerate what they represented. And what they represented was simple. Political power has nothing to do with gender. The ability to command armies, manage economies, navigate crises, these aren't male capabilities, they're human capabilities, and when women exercised them, they often did so brilliantly. The courts knew this. That's why they were terrified, because once you accept that one woman can rule successfully, the entire justification for male-only succession collapses. It's not divine mandate, it's just tradition backed by force, and traditions can be challenged. But here's the twist. The courts failed at erasure. Yes, they killed some of these women. Yes, they distorted their legacies, but they didn't make them disappear. Razia's name survived in folk songs. Theodora's legal reforms remained in Byzantine law. Tamar's churches still stand in Georgia. Irene's restoration of icon veneration shaped Christian theology for a millennium. The policies persisted even when the women who created them were erased from credit. That's a different kind of legacy, structural change so embedded it couldn't be undone. And there's something darker. Every time a court conspired to eliminate a female ruler, they normalized conspiracy as a political tool. The Byzantine Empire that deposed Irene descended into decades of instability, where emperors were regularly overthrown. The Delhi Sultanate that killed Razia saw 8 sultans in 20 years, most removed violently. Turns out, when you normalize elimination, it doesn't stop just because a man is on the throne. But the real legacy isn't in policy. It's in what these women proved was possible. Every single one was an outsider.
Irene was an orphan, Theodora was a circus performer, Razia was the wrong gender. They were all told that power wasn't for them, and they all ignored that message and took it anyway. Yes, they paid terrible prices: exile, assassination, erasure. But they proved the barriers were social constructs, not natural limitations. And that fact, once established, could never be completely erased. It persisted like a crack in a foundation. That's why we're still talking about them. Their stories survived because they raised questions the courts couldn't answer. If she can rule, why not others? If this outsider can govern effectively, what does that say about insiders who claim authority by birthright? Those questions didn't have good answers, so the courts responded with violence and historical revision. They tried to eliminate not just the women, but the questions themselves. They failed. The questions survived. Right now, we're living through another iteration of these same conflicts. Women in power still face coordinated campaigns to undermine their authority, still face different standards, still have their competence questioned in ways male leaders rarely experience. Which means these stories aren't just about the past. They're a playbook for understanding the present. When you see a powerful woman facing coordinated opposition, when you see her decisions attributed to emotional instability, when you see her personal life weaponized against her capacity, you're watching the same patterns that destroyed Razia and Irene. The courts may have feared these women, but history remembers them as icons of courage, cunning, and power. Not because they were perfect, but because they refused to accept limitations placed on them by systems designed to exclude them. They saw thrones supposedly inaccessible and took them anyway. They faced conspiracies that should have destroyed them and survived for years or decades. They left legacies that persisted despite systematic erasure. The empires that feared these women are gone. Byzantium fell. The Delhi Sultanate collapsed. Kievan Rus fragmented. But we still know their names. We still know their stories. The rulers who tried to erase them, most are forgotten. History remembers the women they feared more vividly than the men who feared them. The courts thought they could eliminate these women and everything they represented. What they actually did was guarantee we'd remember them as exactly what they were, proof that the system was lying about who deserved to rule. And that's a truth no amount of conspiracy can fully destroy. If this video made you think differently about power, leave a comment. Tell me which ruler surprised you most. Tell me what modern parallels you see. Because these stories matter. The more we tell them, the harder it becomes to erase them again. The courts feared these women. History vindicated them. And we're still learning from both.